to just reiterate that that is really the hope and the goal of this particular episode is just to, as two people who have navigated and kind of got to the other side of the visceral nature of losing somebody that you care about, and life continues. You know what I mean? Life is still wonderful. Life is still amazing. And in the middle of one of those sort of circumstances, if you lose somebody, I think depending on somebody's demeanor, that can be lost. So in my situation, my sister, my older sister, she was about 7 years older. And technically, she was my half sister. We had the same father. Never really lived with each other that much, but saw her frequently enough, every month, every, other month, something like that when I was younger. Sometimes those younger years are a little fuzzier. And then when I was older, we lived together. She was a senior. I think I was in fourth grade or something like that. So we lived together for about half a year. And then she moved out, and then similar things, saw her every few weeks, every few months for a little bit. But that particular situation was the second time losing somebody. Now, prior to that, my great-grandfather, who we used to live with when we were younger, he got sick and then he was in hospice in the house and he actually transitioned in that same house that we lived in. So that was an intense experience, but I was maybe 5, 6 years old, 7, something like that. And it was really just seeing the people around me and, here's somebody who had always been around and then they're not. And that was kind of my first experience, I feel like, with death. So it didn't really impact me too drastically at that time. And so with my sister, because I think everybody's impacted differently based on how it happens, right? Sometimes you literally get a phone call and you get the news that somebody's gone. And in both of our situations, it was more like a slow burn. Somebody gets sick and then it kind of prepares you for that possibility as opposed to when it's very abrupt. And personally, it was kind of just one of those moments where life doesn't feel real. It's kind of like something happens and me, I was more of the detached type. And I was detached for different reasons, jumping between houses, seeing my mom leaving, seeing my dad gone, so it's kind of just like, oh, she just won't come back, right? And initially, like I said, it just felt like it wasn't real. She was in a car accident, and then she was in a coma for several months. And, we were at this, anyhow, she was in a coma for a few months, and then one night, it was getting pretty bad. We went to the hospital, and that's when the decision had to be made to leave her on life support or take her off. She was taken off. She transitions. And the next day, I went to school. I went to see a movie that evening. And, but in that situation, I felt like what was most difficult it was a couple things. One, it was this feeling of what wouldn't be, right? And I mean that in the sense that there being such a large age difference between myself and my older sister. I have an older brother as well. I'm the youngest. And they had a much closer relationship. And so when she passed, to me, it was kind of like this, damn, well, I'll never have the relationship that they had. We'll never really have that bond because she's not here for us to do that. And that led to its own difficulty and where for years I created this resentment to my brother because I felt like being the younger brother, sometimes the older siblings are together and they're like, hey, go on, you little rascal. We got older sibling things to do. And so I had this resentment for him for years. I never really communicated it. And our relationship before that wasn't really the best. And so that was one of those unique situations where all the dynamics, have an effect on how somebody processes it. But the second effect, and both of these, there's a purpose to me going into this detail, but the second order effect was seeing my dad, right? The natural order of events is, not for the parent to lose their child, right? The parent has a child, they all age, and then, best case scenario, they just transition because they hit 150 years old or something. They're like, you know what, I'm tapping out the game. 150 years is good enough.
Yeah.
And
usually oldest to youngest kind of thing.
Exactly.
That's how people think about it.
Yeah. And so that was and it was his firstborn child. He had her when he was 17. That was his only daughter. And seeing how it affected him, he went to a pretty dark place, depression. And I'd never really been around depression or really had to play with that concept. And so in hindsight, it kind of gave that perspective of how precious life is. And I feel like most people, they always hear that. But it's like life is precious, but relationships are also precious because life on its own, it's like, amoeba is living, You know what I mean? But it's the connection that people share, not to overstep, but presumably, let's say that you never met your father, right? Would it move you the same way if you hear that he passed? So it's not the life in and of
No.
itself, it's the
Not at all.
connection. And as I got older, it was this realization that, okay, at any moment in time, somebody that you're connected to, something could happen. Something can happen to you, something happen to me, right? Or something can happen to the one that I love. So if there was some resentment I was holding, for instance, to my brother, or if my dad was in a dark place, depression, right? You can't be so overwhelmed with the negative affect or the emotion that you stop living life before you've actually passed on. And I think that that is a hard thing for some people to get over because obviously there's going to be a strong feeling, a strong emotion. Everybody processes things differently. I basically just withdrew. I kind of suppressed it. It's like I just didn't really process that it happened. It was one of those things like, well, I didn't really see her that much anyway, so you know, I'm just never going to see her again. And then it's like there are periods in my life where I would forget that I had a sister. So it's like that's some pretty intense suppression. And everybody responds differently. But I think if people keep in mind, it's almost like, what would that other person want? The person who passed on, would they want you to stop living life? Would they want your relationships to deteriorate because you were so distraught about what they were dealing with? I think not. And so, yeah, I'll bounce it back to you before we kind of jump to the next layer of like, how does someone best deal with it? But, you know, those are kind of the main lessons I got was just point blank period. Life is, is precious. And as such, you know, if there's a dispute, if there is a disagreement, if there is a rift between you and another, even if the relationship comes to an end, maybe do your best to reconcile so that at least reconciliation is taking place and there can be some degree of closure if you never saw that person again, whether that's because you never crossed their path or because they transition. And I'd say that was kind of the main, one of the main takeaways for me.